there is a chat. I see someone in the chat saying they can't hear anyone. I need some feedback from people that I can be heard right now and that I am speaking to an audience. Is that all working out?
I can hear you, Nathan.
Very good. Oh, excellent. There they are. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. And again, it's a pleasure. I am the order. We are going to start with John Keeley today, I believe. Correct? John, that it was the plan. Confirm. Okay. And he will be sharing his screen in order to give his talk. John Keeley is with the U.S. Geological Survey. He is based at Sequoia National Park here in California. He has been there for about 20 years. And before that, he was for 20 years a professor at Occidental. He is also currently adjunct professor at UCLA. And he has published many very widely cited articles about fire ecology, and its importance in a variety of different ecosystems. His talk will be followed by Navashni Govender. She is Senior Manager for Conservation Management at Kruger National Park in South Africa. She also has 20 years of experience as an ecologist working with fire for many years in ecology and now in the conservation branch of Kruger. She will be talking to us about her experiences there in South Africa, where some different important pieces of the puzzle that will add to the conversation. Without further ado, I want to turn it over then to John. This is where there would be a big round of applause, and John will kick us off. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Nathan.
John, we're seeing your presentation mode, so if you want to go to the display settings, and you should just be able to switch it right there. Good deal. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Then we're all set? I assume we're all set. Okay. I want to thank Devin and Nathan for the invitation to participate in this conference. I'm talking today along the theme of wicked problems in rangelands, and I'm specifically going to be focused on fire management of Western rangelands largely, and the wicked problems in those. A common theme with respect to wicked problems is often that they are the result of contradictory goals due from by land managers, conservations, and the public. And fire in particular has many wicked problems. I'm going to focus on three in particular: vegetation type conversion, shrub encroachment, invasive plants, and all of these are somewhat interrelated. Now, fire's been present on land for, we know, at least 400 million years. So it's something that many ecosystems have evolved species along with fire. Today, it's a major driver in terms of global vegetation patterns, and ecosystem properties are quite different. And as a result, the fire regime parameters are often very different. The primary drivers in terms of fire regimes are primary productivity, which varies a lot from ecosystem to ecosystem, the seasonality of those systems, ignition sources, and the structure of the fuels. The primary parameters that ultimately affect ecosystems is the frequency of fires, as well as severity and the types of fuels that are consumed. What's interesting is if one looks at global climate models, which basically drive vegetation patterns based on climate and soils, one sees a world that's dominated by green here, which is largely woody angiosperms. But if one compares that with the actual vegetation distribution, what we see is much less green and much more dominated by herbaceous, largely grassland vegetation. So in other words, there's a disjunct between what the climate models say we should get based on climate versus what we actually see. This is an illustration of this, in this illustration here. This is woody plant cover in an ecosystem. These are in Africa. and relative to mean annual precipitation. As precipitation go up, we're capable of seeing more and more dominance by woody vegetation. In other words, they're water limited. But we see also along this gradient, there are a vast number of ecosystems that receive plenty of rainfall. So climatically, they should produce woody vegetation, but instead they're dominated by grasslands. And in a paper that I published a number of years ago, along with my colleague, William Bond, we looked at this disjunct between what climate predicts and what we actually see. And this graph gives a very simple illustration of what the climate potential is in terms of tree biomass globally versus what we actually see. And the difference we describe as consumer control. Of course, not all of this difference between actual and potential is due just to consumers. Some of it's due to substrate and other physical characteristics, but consumers play a big role. And there are really two types of consumers in ecosystems. And this paper describes our focus on fire as a global herbivore in these systems. In other words, these ecosystems are often consumer controlled by consumers such as livestock or consumers such as fire. Livestock reduces the biomass and inhibits fire. Fires, on the other hand, consume forage and inhibit grazing. So there's a competition between these two consumers. Now, fire is a necessary process throughout the world in many ecosystems, but it often is perturbed by humans. And the sorts of perturbations of fire regimes that I'll focus on are things such as reducing the frequency of fire through suppression, reducing fires by altering the fuels by livestock grazing, as well as increasing fire frequency by human ignitions. This is just an illustration of how suppression can alter ecosystems. This is an example taken from the Konza Prairie in eastern Kansas. And in this prairie system, these landscapes in the foreground are burned at various intervals from 2 to 3 years. The area in the background here indicates an area where fire has been kept out for more than a decade. And what we see is a radical change in the vegetation due to change in fire frequency. Now, we also see examples from ecosystems where natural lightning sources play an important role. This is an illustration from the southwestern United States where we have rangelands that are frequented by lightning, and that lightning typically occurs in June, July, towards the end of their winter dry season, and that makes these systems prime for frequent fires. However, what we've often seen is in these systems, by overgrazing the landscape, we eliminate these herbaceous fuels, and that prevents the lightning from carrying fire. Once we keep fire out of the system, we now see shrub encroachment of a lot of very spiny plants like prosopa and acacia in some places. So basically, this is an illustration where overgrazing from livestock can alter the fire frequency by altering the fuel availability. Just to summarize, the idea is overgrazing reduces grass fuels, eliminates natural fires, and results in shrub encroachment. And this has a number of conservation impacts. For example, it produces a vegetation type conversion into a system that's new, such as shrublands, and oftentimes it's associated with the loss of biodiversity. Now, we don't always see a trade-off between grazing and biodiversity. This is an illustration from a part of South Africa known as Namakwaland in the northwestern portion of South Africa. And this is an area that has tremendous ecotourism value. In the spring, you get these fantastic displays, mostly of perennial species. And the ranchers, in this case, make a fair bit of money off the ecotourist business. However, by the end of spring, the flowering is gone, the tourists are no longer interested. They then open up those areas to ranching. And so here's an example where ranching and ecotourism can be quite compatible. Grazing also has other benefits associated with fire. An illustration to me is the fire season in northern Oklahoma, Kansas in 2009, 2010. We had vast numbers of fires, and they were very high intensity, causing a lot of damage and loss to from these wildfires. Normally, the reserves, the conservation reserves in this landscape, would not allow grazing because they were concerned that it upset the conservation value of those reserves. But in this instance, because of the threat of fires and the role that grazers play in competing with fire, they opened up their reserves to allow grazing as a means of reducing fire spread. So it can have real impacts in terms of conservation values. Here's another example from my part of the world in Southern California. There's the nature reserves of Orange County. Covers are a large part of the still undeveloped portions of Southern California. And these reserves were set by the Natural Communities Conservation Program for the protection of several endangered species. And as a result, grazing was not considered a viable option on these lands. However, because of the high frequency of fires, which is largely due to the high population density in this part of the landscape, the reserve is actually being threatened by too much fire, which causes invasive plants such as these brassica that you see in the foreground, and that enhances the fire frequency even more. The reserves is now considering the use of grazing as a conservation measure, and they've been in consultation with a group called Sage Associates from Northern California on how to best use grazing for conservation uses, and in this case, to reduce the flammable fuels and reduce fire frequency that has negative impacts on these systems. Now, the rate at which systems are affected by shrub encroachment varies a lot with different ecosystems. The Central Great Plains is often affected by shrub encroachment when fires are naturally reduced. But drivers of the encroachment vary with different ecosystems. For example, this is an example from California that I'm going to focus on. And this is the first example from the Southwest where overgrazing reduced fuels and reduced natural lightning ignited fires causing shrub encroachment. And this is just an illustration from a couple of the forests in the Southwest in terms of the frequency of lightning, which is dark bar, versus human ignitions, the hatch bar. And we can see in these Southwestern forests, we're seeing most of the landscape dominated by lightning ignitions. However, if we turn our attention here to coastal California, here's a couple forests here, the Los Padres and the Cleveland, and we see that the ratio of lightning to human-caused fires are very different. And in fact, these landscapes are dominated by human-ignited fires. So that changes the potential drivers for shrub encroachment. Here's an illustration of how this human ignition pattern is playing out in terms of fire frequency. This is a map of the national forest in the state. The blue areas indicate areas that have gone very long periods without natural fires. The yellow and orange areas here indicate landscapes that have had way more fire than historically we believe would have ever been the case. And this is all due to human ignitions. And it's believed that these human ignitions began long before Euro-Americans came onto the scene. And in other words, Native Americans did a lot to increase ignitions over the generally low lightning ignited fires. And as a consequence, we see much of the landscape in Central and Southern California dominated by a mosaic. And oftentimes we can demonstrate that much of these grassland areas are really the result of high fire frequency due to anthropogenic ignitions. And we've evaluated this change in vegetation over a 70-year period from the border down here in San Diego all the way up into San Luis Obispo County. And this is a image of the amount of change in from shrublands to grasslands over the last 70 years. The purple areas here indicate landscapes that have been converted from shrubs to grassland in the last 70 years. And so there's been major type conversion in this landscape, and primarily due to accelerated ignition by humans. And we see what happens when we take out the human ignition factor in this historical images from the San Francisco East Bay area. This is an image from 1951 in Tilden Park. And you can see it's relatively wide open. And that's in large part because it was subjected to frequent fires by humans, as well as intensive grazing. And then in the 1960s, this landscape was set aside for conservation value. And here's in 1961, the same scene, and we can see shrubs are coming back into this landscape. And here it is in 1971. Shrubs mostly dominate the landscape. Now, the invasion of these grasslands is often termed shrub encroachment, but technically it isn't really encroachment because encroachment is defined as advancing beyond proper and established boundaries. On these California landscapes, we're seeing recolonization of formerly shrub-dominated landscapes. And so technically, this should be referred to as recolonization as opposed to encroachment. Now, most of our grasslands in the state today are dominated by non-native annual grasses in forbs. On some landscapes, we have good evidence that those non-native annual grasses have replaced native perennial grasslands by overgrazing and drought. But many of our grasslands are the result of type conversion from shrublands and woodlands to grasslands. And this, as I've already mentioned, is due to frequent burning, beginning with Native Americans, continuing with Euro-American colonists. And then in the 20th century, it continued even more by state-managed rangeland improvement program. In other words, it was viewed at the time that shrublands were degraded rangelands. And from an economic point of view, that makes sense. But from a historical perspective, they actually have been degraded from their natural system by human ignitions. In many ways, annual grasslands in our state now are relatively novel ecosystems, and one of the characteristics is they often lack much of the biodiversity of native grasslands, and also they're very vulnerable to invasion because much of the diversity has been taken out, and not just the species diversity, but diversity of growth forms, and it makes them vulnerable to invasion. One of the biggest concerns by a lot of rangeland manager is this invasive thistle, yellow star thistle. And we have good studies showing, this is from Joe DiTomasi and student study of how fire impacts this thistle. And he started with rangelands dominated by this thistle and then subjected them to burning over a period of 3 years, and then evaluated the star thistle cover and the seedlings, and demonstrated that you can eliminate this noxious grass by, this noxious thistle by adding in fire. However, the fire in the system was then ended, and what they found is that over a period of just a few years without fire, the thistle returned with a vengeance. And it illustrates that sometimes these use of fire to manage certain weeds is not a sustainable system unless you want to continually subject them to burning every year. Now, we also have a lot of areas in the state. They're usually localized and patchy of native perennial grasses, and this is Stipa pulchra grasses here that you can see. And those have a lot of diversity, usually a lot of different forbs as well as the native grasses, but they're almost always include about 50% cover, even in the best ones, of non-native annual grasses. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to reduce this non-native grass cover by the use of fire. And this is a study that we began almost a decade ago on San Clemente Island off the coast of Southern California, where we went into these perennial grasslands and burned them with the idea of trying to knock back the annual grasses, yet save the perennial grasses. And the technique worked relatively well in terms of burning these grasslands. And when we looked at the results of this study, what we found is in the very first year after a fire, the perennial grasses were not negatively impacted by the fire, whereas the annual exotic grasses were. Sorry, I wasn't sure how long that video was going to go, so I had to end it. But this is an example of one of our plots, 10 by 10 meter plots, and you can still see bunches here of the perennial grasses that have not totally been consumed. And then we monitored over a period of time the cover of native grass species versus cover of exotic species. And this is the controls that were not burned versus the treated plant plots. And in general, the perennial or native grasses survive quite well relative to controls, whereas the non-native exotic grasses were knocked way back by this burning treatment. And we followed these plots over a period of about 4 years, and the ratio of exotics to natives remained relatively similar. And so we decided to go back in, burn it a second time, and see if we could duplicate the same pattern. And we're now just in the beginning stages of monitoring the second burn. So that's pretty much what I have to say about fire and wicked problems, and look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Why don't we take a couple quick questions now before we go to Navashni, and then, as I said before, we'll have more time at the end for additional questions. As Devin put in the chat, by the way, there is a Q&A box, which is the best place to put your questions. The chat is going to have all sorts of other things as well. Let's quickly start. Eloisa Oporto asks, what makes the Central Great Plains more susceptible to shrub encroachment? John, have you got a quick answer for that?
Well, because climatically, the eastern part of the Great Plains is suitable for woody plant growth. It's one of those areas where climate dictates it should be dominated by woodlands. And so where we see the Great Plains fading into woodlands in the eastern part of the Great Plains, a lot of that is just due entirely to the use of fire.
Okay.
And historically, this happened not just from people, but also lightning is relatively common in the Great Plains. And so it was initiated by lightning fires, which would often spread long distances. But today, those fires don't play the same role at all. And so where you get high rainfall in the eastern part of the Great Plains, you can get woodlands developing.
Great, thank you. Truman Young has a question as well. Why did Native Americans not open up more chaparral to grassland in Southern California? Do we know?
Well, we believe they opened up a great deal of the landscape to grasslands. There's good reason to believe that much of the grasslands throughout Southern California, which are quite plentiful, are due to the replacement of native shrublands with mostly exotic grasses. And in fact, there's good evidence the Native Americans were doing quite a bit of burning. However, they didn't burn the entire landscape because functionally it wasn't useful to burn everything, in part because one thing they needed was firewood. And so they needed to have a mosaic of burning patterns where they could retain some areas for wood, but there was extensive burning. And in fact, there's every reason to believe that when the Euro-Americans came and they brought all these European weeds, what we know from the historical records is those weeds took over rapidly. And in part, we believe that that's due to the fact that the Native Americans were burning these shrub ecosystems so frequently, they were sort of in what I call a quasi-disequilibrium. And that just allowed these exotic weeds to invade very quickly.
Great. I'm going to pose one more, and then we'll go on to Navashni and come back to the questions at the end. Paul Mayman asks, first, would you please provide a definition of overgrazing, a term that you used a few times in your presentation? Second, would you consider an intentional planned effort to reduce invasive annual grass fuels in an effort to meet other natural resource objectives as overgrazing? I'm trying to, maybe I didn't read that correctly. Would you consider an effort to reduce natural fuel as an instance of overgrazing, I guess is a question.
Well, the term overgrazing is a loaded term and people use it differently. I would use the term to describe any extent of grazing which causes unwanted changes in the ecosystem. Okay. If your interest is trying to replace grasslands with prosopis shrublands, then maybe it's not overgrazing. But in most instances, we think of overgrazing as grazing to the extent where you alter that ecosystem.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. And everyone posing questions, sorry we couldn't get to all of them right now, but we will have time at the end. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Navashni Govender. Dr. Govender, as I said, is speaking to us late at night from Kruger National Park in South Africa. Thank you, Navashni, for staying up and for joining us. And please take it away.
Okay, can you hear me, Nathan?
Yes, I can.
And can you now see my slides?
Not yet. Are you sharing your screen?
All right, okay. No, let me just go into the, okay.
There, it's coming up.
And now?
Yes, I can see your screen, your screen now. It's not showing up in presenter mode yet. There we go. And now it's actually it's in your presenter mode. There we go. Perfect. It's all set.
Okay, all set. Thank you. Okay, so good evening to everyone from my side of the pond, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone that has joined the plenary session. As Nathan has introduced me, I am Navashni Govender, and I'm the Senior Manager for Conservation in the world-renowned Kruger National Park. Today, I would like to give you all a perspective, an African perspective of fire, a wicked problem in savannas and grasslands. Rangelands are found throughout the world in a variety of forms, ranging from drylands, shrublands, grasslands, to savannas, to open woodlands. The approach that I've taken to this talk is that fire is a complex issue, a necessary tool within rangelands, rather than seeing it as a wicked problem that is perceived as negative, destructive, and therefore suppressed. However, most people see fires like this, a force that is destructive and damaging for the ecosystem. But do you actually blame people if they are affected by fires, especially at the urban wildfire interface, and when your life, livelihood, and property is destroyed? However, we in Africa and our savannas see fires as a means to clean our landscape of the dead, moribund plant material, unpalatable plant material, to the fresh new grazing and nutritious grazing for wildlife and domestic game, to rejuvenating the landscape and some actually being stimulated, some plants by fires to emerge, and also to have the opportunity to change and to open our wooded vegetation to more open landscapes such as savannas and grasslands. African savannas are complex and dynamic systems characterized by the co-dominance of trees and grasses. They are controlled by the fluctuations of water availability, nutrients, herbivory, and of course fire. Fire is regarded as one of the key drivers in this landscape and often affects and has long shaped our areas in African savannas. However, for some time now, we've been seeing and experiencing a phenomenon that is being termed as the death of savannas. What I'm about to show you some fixed point photographs taken in South Africa illustrating the woody bush thickening that's taking place. This is Shishluwi Amfalozi in 1956, and you can see in this high rainfall area, the photograph in 2012 has been extremely wooded. Even in the Karoo, a lower rainfall, much drier landscape in South Africa, we still see an increase in trees. At high altitudes, in areas of the Drakensberg escarpment have also become more wooded. This is usually the reasons attributed to contributing to this change is an increase in carbon dioxide, but also the inappropriate land management that has taken place, specifically with fire suppression. So why is this phenomenon so serious? Africa is one of the last strongholds for our ever-dwindling megafauna numbers. The majority of these animals are actually found in our open landscapes, such as savannas and grassland biomes. So therefore, the death of savannas or the loss of these landscapes is extremely concerning for Africa. I will now go through a few slides that demonstrate the fire biotic and abiotic interactions and relationships that take place, highlighting the complexity of this ecosystem. In our wet years, we have rainfall enough to consume, we have high rainfall, and the grass biomass that is produced cannot be consumed by all our grazers, and therefore fire plays a much important role as a generalist herbivore. However, in our drier years, fires play less of a role because our herbivores can consume our grasses. This is further illustrated when we looked at the relationship across a rainfall gradient in 6 reserves in Southern Africa, rainfall ranging from about 380 mils to 952 mils. The relationship strength appears to decrease as rainfall increases, meaning that the preceding 2 years' rainfall is a much stronger predictor for amount that is burnt in a current fire season in drier landscapes than our wetter landscapes. This is extremely important for determining how much we need to burn in our areas. The second interaction that I would like to look at is that of fire and herbivory. In Africa and Kruger National Park, in many of our protected areas, fire and herbivores are the main ecosystem engineers of our landscape, and this interaction must not be overlooked. The feeding behavior of our mega herbivores often influence fire patterns and have resultant effects. Here I would like to present a time series of fixed point photographs that have been taken from a 54-year management exclosure in the northern landscapes of Kruger National Park. Initially, this area was established to breed one of our rare antelopes, roan, but now it's used as an excellent field laboratory to demonstrate vegetation changes. So what we are seeing here is a fixed point photograph taken in this area with the fenced area in the background and the wooded area, the fenced area in the background and the foreground, which is unfenced. This is the photograph in 1995. Here we see the photograph in 2005 and finally 2015. What is striking is the significant increase in woody biomass in the fenced areas in the background compared to the unfenced area in the foreground. The difference is that in the background, we were able to keep elephants out of that landscape and therefore allow for successful establishment and recruitment of trees. Please note that fire frequency, intensity, and season was very similar in both areas. Here we have an image of a 67-year long-term fire experiment in the Kruger National Park. The plot on the left receives an annual fire treatment, whilst the plot on the right receives a no-burn treatment and has not been burned for more than 60 years. On these sites, the manipulation of fire and not herbivory has also given rise to significant differences in woody biomass and cover between the two sites. This clearly demonstrates that management of these two drivers are interlinked and must be considered when managing an open landscape with fire and elephants. So what are really the management options that are available? Well, to firstly answer this question, one must decide on actually what your desired state is. There seems to be 4 possible scenarios that may be acceptable to people, depending on who you ask the question. If you like elephants, the acceptable scenarios may be different to a person that likes fire. But by manipulating elephant numbers and impacts and the amount of area that is burnt, one can really influence bush and tree densities in your area. However, if you are in a protected area that is mandated to maintain biodiversity in all its facets and fluxes, one may have to manage for all 4 scenarios. Now, when it comes to our grazers, these lawnmowers also influence our patterns, our fire patterns and biodiversity by creating grazing lawns, which are known as patches of short and long grasses. It has been shown that these grazing lawns that are created by rhinos and hippos are high biodiversity hotspots and support a very unique flora and fauna that make use of these manicured habitats. Currently, in the Kruger National Park, these grazing lawn habitats are steadily decreasing, with significant increase in rhino poaching. If you look at the graph from about 1960, there was a steady but slow increase in the number of rhinos up until 2000, where we see a sharp increase and rapidly in the population numbers. This was about the time that the Kruger National Park actively started its burning program after a period of more than 10 years of only allowing lightning fires to burn. For the next 10 years, our rhino numbers continued to increase steadily up until 2010, where poaching really increased. Since then, our numbers have been decreasing. I would like to take you to the table on the insert, where we see that the birth rates in B are always much lower than the combined death rates, natural death rates, as well as the poaching rates in P. This is despite the large investment in anti-poaching at the cost of conservation and the human well-being of our landscapes, the human well-being of our ranges. Therefore, there now has to be a rethink of the strategy, and we need to move away from the focus of catching poachers but now focusing on our asset, which is our rhinos. Therefore, starting to guard our rhinos more through intensive monitoring. But key for fire management is to improve our habitat so that we see better forage and quality and quantity. Invest in protecting our cows, but invest in rhino conservation and not just anti-poaching. With a consequence of suppressing fires, we see an increase in woody habitat. We see a decrease in forage quality and quantity, a decrease in herbivore numbers, which has knock-on effect on our predators, a decrease in ecotourism and sustainability of our game parks. Finally, maybe KNP may be no more, African savannas lose out, all decreasing, ending up with less megafauna, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, and ultimately the economy. The third point that I would like to look at is the legislation, specifically fire legislation. In many countries, setting fires or prescribed burning is still criminalized, and there are hefty penalties if caught lighting a felt fire. National legislation needs to support fires and not make it difficult or cumbersome to burn responsibly. In South Africa, currently, legislation does not really allow for prescribed burning other than burning fire breaks. With that in mind, we are now putting in amendments to allow for more prescribed burning for fuel reduction, and even going to the extent of requesting that high-intensity fires be allowed for ecological reasons. Fire protection associations is a mechanism to bring different landowners and land users around a table talking about fire. In South Africa, it is compulsory for all government agencies and parastatals to either be a member or form a fire protection association, and it is encouraged that private landowners do the same, as there are considerable benefits linked to becoming members. The legal obligations for members are to secure one's boundaries through fire breaks, have trained staff in felt and infrastructure fighting, have equipment and PPEs available, ultimately to reduce fire risk and get everyone talking about fire. In Africa, fire is still linked to people's livelihoods, economy, and the social well-being. The African landscape and its fauna, flora, and ecosystems are shaped and sustained and has increased over evolutionary times, resulting in changes in the fire regime and consequences for biodiversity. Fires are critical components of these ecosystems and are not always perceived as harmful by local communities. Human alteration of fire season and time of day when fire occurs is very important, as it has implications for fire intensity, tree-grass dynamics, and greenhouse gas emissions. So how do people actually influence the elements of the fire regime? I will now show you examples of how people influence the burnt areas, fire intensity, and fire size. These are figures illustrating the total area burnt over a rainfall gradient in the Kruger National Park. Figure A is that of all fires from 1957 to 2001. Figure B is of the fires burnt from 1957 to 1980 within what we called a fixed fire burning regime, where the frequency and the season was fixed. Figure C, we termed the flexible burning regime from 1981 to 1991, where the frequency of burning was fixed 3 years, but we tried to vary the season of burn. And finally, figure 3, 1992 to 2001, was the period where managers lit no fires in the Kruger National Park, and only lightning was deemed the dominant ignition source. So from this, we can see that despite what we as managers said we will burn and how we will burn, we were not able to influence the total area burnt, and that was controlled by rainfall. But what are we able to influence as managers? And that is the intensity of burns and the timing of burns. We see in each of the eras, fixed rotational, flexible rotational, and natural or lightning fires era, we were able to shift from cooler, early season fires to more late, high intensity season fires. And therefore, the fire intensity is the one variable that we can influence as people. To investigate the relationship between people and fire size, we turn to the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park. Established in 2002, this park is made up of 3 areas, 3 countries, and 3 parks: South Africa, Kruger National Park; Mozambique, the Limpopo National Park; and Zimbabwe, Gonaruzu National Park. For these analyses, we focused on Kruger and Limpopo National Park. The fire management strategy within the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park can be described as 2 very different management strategies. Kruger has a very structured and intensive fire management, more likened to command and control, where Limpopo National Park is very unstructured, hands-off, and a laissez-faire approach. Kruger has a long history of fire research, spanning more than 60 years, where fire research in Limpopo National Park is in its infancy, about 5 years. Very important is that in Kruger, there are less than 1,000 people living in the park permanently, and these are usually in restricted areas and small camps. However, in Limpopo National Park, we have more than 8,000 people living in the park, specifically along its river and its drainage lines. Finally, in Kruger, fire is used as an ecological tool, while in Limpopo National Park, fire is still used as a tool to sustain livelihoods as well as an ecological tool. When we look at the area burnt in the landscapes between the fire sizes, ranging from large, medium, and small, we can see that the Kruger National Park has a much larger fires compared to Limpopo National Park. This was very unexpected, as the Kruger has a much more extensive road network and more people to suppress the fires. However, with people lighting fires, more people in Limpopo National Park lighting fires early in the fire season and breaking up the fuel load, thereby reducing the areas burned by high intensity fires. Number 5, I would like to look at climate change effects on fire danger indices. I would Fire weather is definitely changing with more red days and longer fire seasons. We're experiencing more extreme fire weathers. In 2015, 2016, the Kruger National Park experienced the worst drought with regards to rainfall in the history of the park. As a conservation manager, we took this opportunity to measure as many variables as we could and learn from these events. One such variable that was measured and documented was that of ambient temperature. When we compared the number of days above 35 degrees Celsius or 95 Fahrenheit, we see in 91-92 there were 74 days, and in 2015-2016 there were 136 days above 35 degrees. We then took this a bit further and looked at the number of days during the drought, both droughts that were above 40 degrees or 104 Fahrenheit. And you can see in 91-92, there were 7 days, but in 2015-2016, we had more than 3 times that, with most days in December being above, 8 days in December being above 40 degrees. Higher fire danger index and dry vegetation allow for more wildfires and mega fires to burn. And as higher fire intensities has consequences on carbon emissions. There have been concerted efforts made to change the fire intensities to reduce carbon emissions. This is done by increasing and setting more early season cooler fires and to reduce the late season hotter fires, often referred to as patch mosaic burning. Successful projects include those in Pilanesberg National Park, Kakadu National Park, Arnhem Land in Australia, and we are implementing this burning regimes in the Kruger National Park, but mainly to reduce the loss of tall trees. Western hydrologies of reforestation and the degradation of land for carbon credits. These are usually implemented by projects such as the Bond Challenge, the AFR 100, and the UN Trillion Tree Campaign. Very noble initiative to address a problem of climate change and carbon sequestration, but actually creating other problems. Models to identify areas for restoration for these initiatives classify areas such as the Kruger National Park and the Serengeti as degraded landscapes because our current vegetation biomass, grasslands and savannas, is not at its maximum potential for what our climate is, but ignoring the fact that these landscapes are ancient grasslands and extremely biodiverse areas. Therefore, areas such as these are usually targeted for rehabilitation and restoring them with alien invasive species such as rapidly growing pine and eucalypt trees. The Drakensberg Mountain in South Africa is commonly known as the Water Tower, is one such area destined for reforestation according to these initiatives. And what is more alarming is that most countries that have made these pledges do come from developing nations. Please take note that the figure for America is mainly made up from countries from Latin America. The benefits of reforestation and for reducing global warming is poorly supported by science. However, the cost of extensive land transformation, the gains in carbon sequestration is very small. Biodiversity loss is not acknowledged and even ignored, and there is reduced stream flow and lost resilient water resources. The tree species planted within these fire-prone environments and landscapes would be more likely to increase the fire frequency, increase fire intensity, and have more frequent out-of-season fires, thereby leading to a loss of vegetation, increase in soil erosion, and threatening lives and property, which we have already seen happening in South Africa. Fire in Africa is indeed a wicked problem because of its complexity, the necessity to use as a management tool, and its interaction with other drivers. Yes, Africa has a lot of fires, but it's not as bad and can be very good for ecology and people. Africa and its people have lived with fire, evolved with fire, and managed fire for millennia. The question now is, can the rest of the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Navashni. We have got a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. I want to encourage members of the audience to add additional questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. It looks like we have about 33 minutes left. I want to take a few questions just for Navashni first, and then we'll open it up to both of our speakers. First question comes from Truman Young. How similar and different are the no elephant and the no fire experimental plots? They are both more woody, as we can tell from the photographs, but are they woody with similar species? And what about the understory?
Okay, I think they are definitely similar in woody biomass and cover, but the two sites that I've shown you is extreme in the park. The fenced exclosure area is actually in the far north of the park and is made up of different species. But one thing that's really remarkable there, that in the fenced area, we're seeing these huge lala palms appearing. But down south in the high rainfall Salfeld areas, we're seeing specific species for that region. But comparing those two areas, we cannot, because they are in very vastly different landscapes. But the principle is the same, that if you fence out elephants, and you keep elephants or fire out, you get changes in the species.
Interesting. Next question comes from Elena Dos Amantes. How many animal units are elephants and white rhinos?
Oh gosh, that's an animal ecologist. No, I don't know. No, I'm sorry.
If anybody has the answer to that question, they should type it into the chat or the Q&A. May Elsinger asks, is there a positive influence of brush tree increase on poaching? For example, does more brush and tree cover enable poachers to hide, sneak in, poach, and escape with their prey?
Yes, so we are seeing that, so much so that we now have included burning for detection as part of our management plan. And that has not been a reason why we would burn previously. But in the last 5 years, we've seen that we have to burn areas to open up the veld, and it's much easier to see tracks in the ash and in the sand rather than in grass dominated areas. So we actually have a reason now where we would document this area was burnt because it is used for detection. So yes, poachers are using that, but we are also using fire to open up the landscape for those reasons as well.
Interesting. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Do the numbers of native herbivores, historic versus current numbers, have an impact on the dynamics of fire? For example, the diversity and higher numbers did the diversity and higher numbers historically influence how many acres burned or how well the ecosystem responded?
So in terms of animal numbers, we're having much higher numbers of animals now. So if you say that previously we had higher numbers, we're seeing, because we've been able to protect these landscapes so successively, especially our elephants, we're seeing much higher numbers. And in terms of the fire, we're not seeing any difference. So in terms of grazing, no difference, but we're seeing an impact on our woody vegetation with a lot more browsers in the landscape and a loss of tall trees. So the impact of our browsers on the woody vegetation is much higher now because of the large numbers of animals that we are having, but no real impact on the herbaceous layers and fire, where we see a stronger correlation with what is burning or amount is burning linked to rainfall rather than a burden.
Interesting. The next question, really, I think we should open this up now to both of our speakers. Actually, first, Lynn Hunsinger posed a question that I think she initially had in mind John for this, but Devin suggested perhaps both of you would like to start by giving us your a definition of biodiversity, specifically a working definition that you might use in the context of discussing fire management in particular.
I'm happy to address that. The whole question of biodiversity depends on what aspect of diversity you're interested in. For example, people tend to think of biodiversity as just numbers of species, but ecologists very often think of it more broadly in terms of functional diversity. So growth form diversity would be a good example. So for example, if we compared annual grasslands with native grasslands, certainly there's significant differences in structural diversity between those systems. You walk into a annual grassland and you're not going to see the same diversity of growth forms as you will in a perennial grassland. So, and diversity is described for lots of other attributes, ecosystem attributes. But like I say, I think most people think of it as the numbers of species.
Tamashni?
So in relation to biodiversity and fire, we're seeing bigger changes, as John has mentioned, in the structure and the structural vegetation structure rather than species composition, because it seems as though our vegetation is very much fire adapted. We may get one or two species that if you pull fire out for 60 years, you'll get a forest species coming in, but that's insignificant compared to the suite of species that we have. So in terms of species diversity, we don't lose any species if you pull fire out or put fire in. But where you see the changes is when you pull fire out is in the biomass, woody biomass, the vegetation structure. So if you do have fire, then you frequent fires, you lose an intermediate, the middle height class. So you have a lot of the shrub layer and a few tall trees, but you're losing out the whole suite of structural diversity, and that's quite important. And then there's also, in terms of cover, we see higher vegetation cover in areas which we are with no fire compared to areas with fire.
Very good, thank you. Brandon Bestelmeyer has a question for both of you as well. Could you comment on the effect of fire for carbon sequestration on rangeland systems? This obviously did come up in Navashni's talk, but I think Brandon's specifically curious to ask, are the goals for vegetation structure and composition, for example, grasses versus woody plants, and carbon storage largely congruent, or are they in conflict? And if they're in conflict, how should we try to reconcile them?
So the one, I'll answer that first. So the one issue that we have, especially in African savannas in Southern Africa, is that when you look at fire and carbon emissions, Africa is lumped as a single figure. And it's not taken into account that the next year we get a regrowth, or our grass biomass then is replenished, and that carbon is brought back into the system. And therefore, it's really important to differentiate between savannas or grasslands burning and what the emission is compared to when a forest is burning or wooded landscapes. And I think that is the main problem that we are seeing. And when everyone says Africa is burning and it's contributing to carbon emissions or carbon sequestration, I think there has to be this distinction between savannas and grasslands compared to our forests. So that's what we would like to see.
Could I push you just a little bit further on that then? What about carbon sequestration in soils as a part of that discussion?
Yeah, so that is now we are saying that the carbon, below storage carbon, is much higher than what you would gain by planting all these trees. So in the landscapes that have been earmarked for reforestation, our grasslands and our savannas, but no consideration is given to the below storage carbon, which if you've taken all the negative impacts, is much higher than what you would get by planting 1 million hectares of woody biomass. So we're seeing those figures now, and that's what we need to actually demonstrate.
John?
I think Namashni covered it quite well. I really have nothing more to add.
Okay, I'm going to pose a question of my own just, and then we'll get back on the Q&A list. Climate change has come up in the talks, but I'm curious to get your reactions to Stephen Pine's declaration that the Pyrocene is the name he would give to the era we are moving into. This is maybe a variation on the Anthropocene idea, but that I think what he's trying to suggest is that we are entering, because of climate change, into a period of basically qualitatively different fire dynamics, and that the patterns and relationships that we may have seen based on past observations and ecological dynamics might might be shifting because of the interaction of climate and fire. And I'm curious what the two of you think about that. John, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think it's simplistic to think that we can describe climate change as the primary or only factor driving fires. It varies a whole lot dependent upon what part of the landscape you're looking at. We've done extensive studies of the role of climate and fire in California for the last 100 years. And there's no question that temperatures affect fire activity in some ecosystems and not in other ecosystems. For example, conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada and Northern California, very sensitive to spring and summer temperatures. And we could, over 100 years, we can predict that the amount of area burned with at least 50 to 55% accuracy, depending on if you know spring and summer temperatures. If you look at someplace like Southern California, there's no relationship between spring and summer temperatures, or for that matter, any climate parameter in terms of fire activity. And the primary reason is that in lower elevations, particularly Southern California, it's hot enough and dry enough every year for a big fire. And so it's questionable how much climate change is going to alter our fire regimes. And it's primarily because our fires are driven by two factors that are not related to climate. And one of them is human ignitions, and the other is extreme wind events. And we have these autumn winds, just like you have in the Bay Area, where they call them north winds or Diablo winds. We have our Santa Ana winds. And I've just finished a paper that's now in review that has looked at 70 years of Santa Ana wind activity and fires. And what we find is climate has no significant relationship to how much area burns. What is primarily driving these fires is the wind intensity, which may be changing, and it may have an anthropogenic climate change component, but we don't know that. But the other thing is ignitions. 75% of all our days with extreme winds, we get no fire at all. And that's because fires are a function of the serendipity of an ignition occurring at the same time as a wind event. And that's driven by people and largely accidental ignition sources. In Southern California, the area burned over the last decade has been almost 100% due to power line failures. And power line failures in the future we might be able to reduce them, but it largely depends on societal decisions about how we want to deal with power lines and the role they play in fire. For example, there's two main reasons we get power line failures starting fires, and that's either poor maintenance or it's just the increased distribution of development, which has greatly increased the opportunities for power line failures. And so we find that ignitions, when we model the amount of area burned in Southern California over the last 30 years, the primary driver in those models is numbers of ignitions during a wind event. Things like temperature and precipitation, no relationship at all to area burned. So in terms of what climate change is going to do, there's every reason to believe that as temperatures get warmer, we're going to see worse fire conditions in forested environments. However, fires in the forest are not just due to the climate, they're also due to fuel accumulation, which has gotten very high. In fact, it's estimated that today the fuels in Sierra Nevada forests probably 5 times higher than they were historically before they were colonized by Euro-Americans. And so we've put out fires in those forests to cause fuels to accumulate. So even though climate is important, we don't know how important it's going to be in the future if we can change the fuel structure, because we're seeing an increase in climate affecting fires in the Sierras in the last several decades, but we're also it's also coincides with an increase in fuels over the last 100 years. If we modify those fuels and deal with the fuel situation, there's no way of saying that climate change is necessarily going to cause worse fires. But if it does, it's most likely going to happen in forested landscapes.
Thank you. Navashni?
Okay, so in Africa, ignition sources is certainly not a limiting factor. We have enough people around to be the ignition source. So we have enough ignition sources. The thing about climate change and the way it's changing our landscape, in savannas, we're seeing a lot of bush thickening taking place, woody vegetation. And what we are seeing is that with climate change and the increase in temperature, as I've mentioned, we're getting high FTI days and therefore hotter fires. Because of the historical suppression of fires and having no fires, and then the woody encroachment, we will actually welcome these hot fires, these high intensity fires, because our vegetation, we really cannot kill with one fire. We need an extreme fire event. So we're actually using the changes in the high FDI and the high intensity fires to actually address an ecological problem with thickening. So in terms of climate, the increase in CO2 is increasing our woody vegetation. We are going to get hotter fires. We're seeing that. And therefore, we would like to use those hotter fires and aim for those days that we know we're going to get those red days, hot fires, and actually then be able to remove the woody vegetation that has encroached.
That's interesting. Coming back to California, I've seen a study which is based in significant part on modeling for California that introduces a variable that, John, you didn't mention with respect to climate change, and that is the postponing of the onset of the wet season in the fall and into the winter. The likelihood of a sort of an intersection, a combination of hot and dry and windy, the likelihood of that happening, or the number of days a year when it's likely to happen, appears to be greatly heightened by climate change. And this could have an effect on the frequency with which we have very, very large fires. But
let me just make one comment about that.
Yeah,
it's one thing to show that the climate is going to change in a particular way and then make an inference about what that will do in terms of fire. We've actually looked at temperature and precipitation during Santa Ana wind events, and fire size is unrelated to temperature or precipitation during those Santa Ana wind events. So it would seem logical that if it's going to get drier, fires are going to get worse. But you have to realize in Southern California, it's already bone dry in the fall. And we find that even when there is precipitation, it doesn't have any significant effect on reducing the amount of area burned. And that's largely because the area burned is really a result of the coincidence of an ignition with the wind event, because the wind event itself is very dry winds, and it dries out the landscape very rapidly. You could get a rainfall event, and within a week or so, the Santa Ana winds could dry it down to the level where it has no significant role. So one has to keep in mind that even though it seems logical that as precipitation changes its timing, it should have an effect, but in not all instances is that the case. And when you have these extreme winds, it really overrides those temperature and precipitation factors.
Got it. Interesting. The next question comes from Will Munger, and maybe Navashni, you want to speak to this first. It did come up in your talk. What are your thoughts on the social, cultural, and governance institutions needed to get prescribed fire on the landscape?
Okay, so one of the first things is that we shouldn't have legislation that says that you will be put in prison or criminalized if you light a fire. And we see that in many African countries, where it actually states that it is a criminal offense to light a fire. So I think that is the first thing to change. But I also feel that we need to have legislation that is actually supportive of fires and to allow for prescribed burning to take place. And to find areas where that is actually done is very difficult. And I think the South African policy legislation has been largely driven by the forestry industry that we have here, and it's usually fire adverse. And it is now the ecological and conservation guys that are getting into the game and saying that we actually need to use fire as a tool. So I think that's the first thing. But from a social point of view, it is recognized that fire is part of our landscape, and people still in Africa use fire for their livelihoods. So I think one first and foremost is that we need much more supportive legislation, and we need to be able to do that to support the lighting of fires. And I think one way that we are trying to do that is to bring the different land users together. Where previously it was each land user dealing with fire by themselves, but the model of using fire protection associations and having the benefits associated with becoming a member of a fire protection association allows for the different land users to come around, chat, and then to decide on how they're going to manage fires in those areas. So I think that has been a really good way to advance people talking and coming to an agreement on how we should manage fires in our areas within these fire protection associations.
Let me make just one comment about this whole role of prescription burning. One has to recognize that prescription burning has a role in some ecosystems and not in other ecosystems. And like California, there's a tremendous need for prescription burning in our forested landscapes due to past management practices where natural fires have been eliminated for over 100 years. But there are other parts of our landscape, we have way more fire than we ever had historically, and it is causing type conversion of native systems to exotic systems. And we don't want to be putting prescription burning on those landscapes simply because they already have way too much fire. And when you think of why you're doing the burning, it's usually to alter the fuel loads so that they're not conducive to fires. But if you look at the big fires in the southern part of the state in the last, say, 50 years, there's almost no part of that landscape that had ever escaped fire in the past. Most of our landscapes are burning at such high frequency that you're not going to be looking at landscapes in need of reducing the fuel loads, because ultimately it's not the fuels themselves that drive the fire. It's where people live and igniting fires during extreme wind events rather than the fuels themselves.
Although as a longtime resident of southern Arizona, I would hasten to add that there are places where that's not the case, where it is very much about the fine fuels, because there's so much lightning that you're going to get ignition if you have fine fuels. Once again, it's just another instance of it's all in the details, it's all in the context, right?
Yep.
We have a couple questions in the Q&A for Navashni. Curious about you mentioned the advantages of very hot fires. One anonymous attendee asks if the fires can get so hot that they harm soil organic matter or soil biota or seed banks. And another, myriad yuckers asks if there is concern that hotter or more intense fires might have risks in terms of non-native plant establishment or other possible downsides.
Okay, in terms of high intensity fires and these extreme fires that we would like to have, it's usually just an initial fire to reset the system, to have 100% top kill of our vegetation, and then to have follow-up cooler fires. So indeed, we're seeing that on our experimental burn plots where we do have these repetitive annual burns for about 60 years. We're seeing a change in the soil structure. We're seeing a capping layer forming, as well as then more runoff on these plots. So if you're burning every year for 60 years, you're going to change the soil structure and function. So that we do recognize that. But what we are trying to do with our high intensity burns and what we would like to achieve is to have an initial burn to reset the system, get the vegetation, as Winston say, 100% top kill. So you're unable to kill the vegetation with just a once-off fire, because a lot of our vegetation has evolved with fire and therefore will start coppicing and regrowing. So it is very difficult with a single fire. But what we are using is the fire intensity to have an initial resetting of the system and followed up with cooler, more growing season burns. So that's what we are trying to do.
Interesting. Okay. That actually caught my eye in one of your slides, that if you change the time of day, that fires are burning, that it can have a significant impacts for the vegetation. Could you give us a quick example of that, just summarizing how that works?
So the time
is it just temperature?
Yeah, so the time of day usually refers to the climatic conditions. So 12 o'clock in day, you have high temperatures, low relative humidity, and that influences the fire intensity. But a better way to influence fire intensity is fuel moisture content. So burn in your drier seasons when your fuel moisture content is lower rather than in the growing season. So there's various ways that you can influence fire intensity. And what we're trying to do is make it easier for the manager. So if you can achieve the same fire intensity in a growing season compared to a dry season fire, you will have a much more controlled fire by changing the time of day. So these are different variables. And then you also look at fuel load. So if you have 2 or 3 years worth of fuel compared to 1 year's worth of fuel, then that will change the fire intensity. But that is one of the variables that we will use to tweak and to get fire intensity either increasing or decreasing. So, yeah.
Thank you. Barry Irving has a question for John Keeley. He says, you drew a sequence of grazing causing less fire and more trees. In temperate grasslands on the forest grassland transition, can the removal of grazing result in more trees through microsite modification, such as increased soil moisture, that results in short-term health of grasslands, but long-term massive invasion by trees?
Well, it depends a lot on the system you're referring to. For example, we certainly see that impact in California grasslands. Removing grazing does cause increase in shrub growth, and it's largely because, unlike the example in the Southwest that I mentioned, where the overgrazing reduced the fuels that allowed shrubs to come in, these are things like prosopis, which are spiny and not very palatable, and so they do quite well with extensive grazing. But then there are places like California, where most of the shrubs that come into grasslands once with or without grazing, they're very palatable. And so the livestock often will browse on the shrubs as well as graze the grasslands. And so in that system, removing grazing actually will enhance shrub invasion into that system.
Okay, I am looking at the Q&A. We've got a question again for Navashni. How do rhinos create grazing lawns? Is it just how they graze?
White rhinos is just how they graze. Typical lawn mowers. That's what they are. So that's how they create when they selectively feed within the landscape. And when they like a patch, and usually the rhinos are territorial, the males, and they will come back to these areas. So they will, it's a typical analogy of a lawnmower. Yeah, it's just their feeding behavior, and that's how they feed.
Scott Chamberlain asked, could a mechanical treatment be used if fire intensity is a problem? In the Western US, some use the method of chaining. For example, are there things I think this is getting to the question of how we might deal with some of those excessive woody fuel loads in forests that John was alluding to.
Well, there's no question mechanical treatments such as that have been used for a very long time. If you look at fuel treatments in many of our Western forests, certainly in California, for a long time, there was minimal amount of prescription burning. It was mostly mechanical treatments. There are limitations, though, to mechanical treatments, one of which is the expense of using mechanical treatments. The other is it is very difficult to achieve on rugged landscapes. And then on top of that, it has negative impacts on soil compaction, which is not desirable. And so in a lot of instances, burning is preferable over mechanical treatments. And then if you look at different jurisdictions, for example, the National Park Service, we're not allowed to do mechanical treatments because the mandate is to maintain these systems in a state similar to what we found them. And so there's a necessity to use natural ecosystem processes like fire and not to use mechanical treatments. But there's no question mechanical treatments have a role. And in combination with prescription burning, they're a viable way of reducing fuels.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I want to give each of the speakers a chance to offer their closing thoughts and reflections on the panel before we run out of time. John, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think the important things to understand about the role of fire in most ecosystems has a lot to do with the ecosystem properties and the fire regime properties, and different landscapes have very different needs and very different impacts. And so we see some landscapes where fire is important in order to offset historical patterns of fire suppression, which has caused accumulation of fuels that are unnatural. And there we need to do treatments that reduce those fuels. But then we have a lot of other landscapes where people have had a very different impact. And certainly California is a good illustration of a landscape where humans have had big impacts in terms of increasing fire incidents. And so if you look at the last 20 years of fires in California, we see a substantial increase. In fact, the last 20 years, we've had at least a doubling of the amount of area burned compared to the previous 20 years. And it also coincides with an increase in temperature of 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, depending on the models. But there's also the fact that California has grown in population. And it's already the most populous state in the nation. 1 out of 8 Americans live in California, and it's been growing at the rate of 300,000 people a year for about 50 years. You put more people on the landscape and you increase the incidence of human ignitions. You increase the number of people who are put at risk because of urban sprawl. They're pushed out into landscapes of hazardous fuels. So it's perhaps no wonder that we're seeing more people killed and more property destroyed simply because we have more people at risk. So we need to deal with fire situations from a multifactorial perspective. We need to think not just about the fuels, not just about the climate, but about the demography and what's happening in terms of people and where people are living. Thank you.
Thank you. Navashni.
Yes, thank you very much. So for me and for us in our savannas and grasslands, it's fire is a tool that we are using and we should be using to reclaim those landscapes and maintain those landscapes because they are very diverse and they do support a herbivore and wildlife that is much needed for our parks and economy in Africa. So I think firstly we have to use fires, and to take fire out of the system will be detrimental, and we have seen that, and we've shown that if you do remove fire, you have significant changes in the landscape. But now we have to not only use fire to maintain the healthy landscape, but we can and we have to use fire to reclaim these landscapes because of bush encroachment, bush thickening taking place. And it really doesn't help when we are now being touted to plant trees. And these are all these invasive species like eucalypts and pine to solve another problem. So that's what we in Africa are grappling with. So yeah, I think fire is a very positive tool. It's when we have to use it. And the one thing is that in Africa, fire and people are very entwined. And it's still a very basic tool that we use. And it's something that cannot be removed from Africa.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our speakers, John Keeley and Navashni Govender, once again for marvelous talks. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for turning out. Under these strange circumstances, it sounds like any SRM we will hopefully have in the future. I guess I would close just with the thought that fire is unquestionably a wicked problem, and in ways that are both good and challenging, as well as perhaps dangerous and bad. I think it is an interesting question whether fire is any more wicked a problem today than it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Or whether it's just that we are now finally in the last 20 years or so coming to realize how complicated fire is and no longer assuming that we can just offer some simple answer along the lines of suppression or burn everything. In other words, maybe it's that our thinking is catching up with the complexity of the problem rather than the problem is becoming more complex than it used to be. In any case, thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the SRM conference. And Navashni, thank you so much for staying up until midnight. We'll let you sign off and get some sleep.
Okay,
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, John.